If I asked you to measure the success of a country, what's the very first thing you would point to? You'd probably point to wealth, right? Like you would look at the gross national product, the stock market, maybe the per capita income. But I want to start today with a paradox that completely shatters that assumption.
It really does.
Why does a man living in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, surrounded by literally the greatest concentration of wealth in the history of the world, have a lower chance of living to age 40 than a man living in significantly poorer regions of Bangladesh?
It is honestly the ultimate diagnostic failure of modern economics.
Yeah.
Because if wealth is the ultimate cure-all, I mean, if a high per capita income is the definitive proof that a society is healthy and developed, that paradox simply shouldn't exist.
Right.
The man in New York should outlive the man in Bangladesh by decades. And yet, the actuarial tables don't lie. He just doesn't.
Welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive. Today we are taking a massive stack of research centering on Amartya Sen's seminal thesis, Development as Freedom, and we're going to extract the core insights to help you rethink everything you know about global progress. Our mission today is to completely rewrite the scorecard of humanity.
Exactly.
We're going to look past the money and figure out what actually makes a human life valuable.
And the overarching theme we'll be exploring here is that human freedom is not merely a byproduct of economic growth.
Yeah.
It's not, some luxury prize that a society gets to enjoy only after it has built enough factories and amassed enough capital.
Like a reward for good behavior.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Rather, freedom is both the primary end and the principal means of development.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how we mismeasure progress today, we actually need to rewind the clock. Way back. Because long before we had spreadsheets and, GDP trackers, ancient philosophers were already grappling with the true utility of wealth.
They were.
We've become so obsessed with the numbers on the screen that we've completely forgotten what those numbers were invented to represent in the first place.
Yeah, to ground this, we can look at an incredibly profound moment in an 8th century BC Sanskrit text, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad.
Oh, wow. That is going way back.
Yeah, it describes a conversation between a woman named Maitreyi and her husband, Yajnavalkya. They are discussing wealth, and Maitreyi asks a question that really strikes at the very heart of human ambition. She wants to know if the entire earth, completely full of wealth, were to belong just to her, would she achieve immortality through it?
It's the ultimate can money buy happiness question, but scaled up to the absolute extreme. She's essentially asking, if I win the ultimate game of capitalism, do I transcend the human condition?
Precisely. And Yajnavalkya replies with a refreshing, if brutal, honesty. He tells her no. He explains that her life would just be like the life of any rich person. Wealth only grants you the lifestyle of the wealthy. It cannot buy immortality, nor can it purchase the ultimate good or meaning in a life. Maitreyi processes this and responds with a line that has echoed through Indian philosophy for millennia. She says, "What should I do with that by which I do not become immortal?"
It's a philosophical mic drop from nearly 3,000 years ago. She realizes that accumulating something that doesn't actually solve her fundamental existential problem is just a waste of time. And you see this exact same logic mirrored in Western philosophy, too.
They do, yeah.
Take Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He writes, "Wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else."
Merely useful.
Yeah.
It's a perfect distillation of the problem. Wealth is a tool. But modern economic development is currently and mistakenly defined almost entirely by the accumulation of these merely useful things.
Right. We measure the gross national product, personal incomes, industrialization, technological advance.
Exactly. We measure the tools, not what the tools are building.
It's kind of like evaluating a carpenter entirely by how many hammers he owns without ever checking to see if he can build a house that won't collapse in the wind. Like, we walk into his workshop, see 1,000 hammers and say, wow, what an incredibly developed carpenter. Meanwhile, the guy is sleeping in the rain.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the categorical error we're making here. Income and wealth are admirable general-purpose means, but they are not the destination. The destination is the freedom to lead the kind of lives we have reason to value.
Okay, so freedom is the actual destination.
Right. When we look at this framework of development as freedom, there are two distinct reasons why freedom must be the central focus. The first is what we call the evaluative reason.
Meaning, this is the actual metric we should be using to evaluate success. So we evaluate the carpenter by the quality of the house, not the quantity of the hammers. We must assess a society's progress primarily by whether the freedoms that people have are actually enhanced.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But the second reason is even more fundamental. It's the effectiveness reason. This is the idea that free agency is the actual mechanical engine that drives development forward.
Ah,
The achievement of development is thoroughly dependent on the free agency of people.
so freedom isn't just the destination we're trying to reach, it's the vehicle we have to drive
Yeah.
to get there. If you don't have free people making free choices, the engine of development stalls out completely.
Yes. Freedom is both the goal and the tool to reach the goal.
But let's bring this out of the realm of ancient philosophy and metaphors, because this isn't just an academic debate. Failing to define development as freedom has lethal, real-world consequences.
It really does.
Let's go back to that paradox I mentioned at the start of the deep dive. The man in Harlem versus the man in Bangladesh.
Yeah, this is a startling reality that forces us to confront the failure of our current metrics. When you look at per capita income, even adjusted for the cost of living, African Americans are infinitely richer than the populations of places like Kerala, India, or China. If income is our only metric, the African American population should be experiencing a massively higher level of development.
Right, their wealth score is incredibly high on the global stage.
But when you look at the fundamental capability to survive, the most basic freedom a human can have, which is the freedom to continue breathing, the data flips entirely.
It's crazy.
African American men have an absolutely lower chance of reaching mature ages than men in China or Kerala. And this isn't just an anomaly for men. African American women end up having a survival pattern for higher ages that is similar to the much poorer Chinese population and decidedly lower than the poorer Indians in Kerala.
I just want to pause and let that sink in for a second for everyone listening. We're talking about citizens living within the borders of the most formidable economic engine on the planet, dying earlier than people living in agrarian, developing economies. How does the data explain this? Because it can't just be a glitch in the matrix.
It is absolutely not a glitch. It is the direct result of systemic unfreedom. While these marginalized communities in the U.S. are richer in income, they're absolutely more deprived in the capability to survive.
Because of?
Because of structural barriers, a lack of comprehensive medical coverage, inadequate public health care infrastructure, higher prevalence of neighborhood violence, and socially alienating arrangements.
So a man in Harlem might have a higher daily income than a farmer in Kerala, but if that man in Harlem gets sick, the structural barriers to healthcare might bankrupt him or deny him treatment entirely.
Exactly.
And the farmer in Kerala, despite having less cash, has access to a robust public health system and basic education that allows him to navigate his health better. The cash is useless if the system denies you the capability to use it for survival.
Precisely. And to drive the severity of this home, we can look at a deeply personal, heartbreaking historical anecdote from Amartya Sen's own childhood that puts a human face on this abstract concept of unfreedom.
Yeah, the story of Mia. It's incredibly difficult to read, but it perfectly encapsulates how these systems trap people. This took place in Dhaka, Bangladesh, during a period of intense, incredibly violent communal riots between Hindus and Muslims.
Right. Sen was just a child at the time, playing in the garden of his family's home in a largely Hindu neighborhood. Suddenly, a man came stumbling through the gate, screaming and bleeding profusely.
Oh, man.
He had been stabbed in the back by a mob. This man was Mia, a Muslim daily laborer.
Now, in the middle of a brutal sectarian riot, a Muslim man going into a fiercely Hindu neighborhood was effectively a death sentence. It was common knowledge. So the immediate question is, why was he there? Why did he walk into a zone where his murder was almost guaranteed?
As he was being rushed to the hospital where he would tragically later die from his wounds, Mia explained to the adults trying to save him. His wife had begged him not to go into the hostile area. She knew it was lethal.
But he went anyway.
But he had to. His family had absolutely nothing to eat. They were starving. He had found a tiny opportunity for wage labor in that neighborhood, and he had to take it.
He traded his physical safety for a handful of coins just to keep his children from starving to death.
What is essential to understand from this tragedy is the mechanical relationship between different types of unfreedom. Economic unfreedom, in Mia's case, extreme desperate poverty, directly bred physical and social unfreedom.
Wow.
He did not want to go into that neighborhood. He was completely stripped of his agency by hunger. His lack of the basic freedom to eat forced him into a situation that violently stripped him of his freedom to live.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because once you see unfreedom not just as a lack of cash, but as a web of interconnected traps like Cater Mia being forced into a riot zone by hunger, or a man in Harlem lacking the capability of healthcare, you start asking the most important question.
Which is, how do we fix it?
Exactly. How do we dismantle the traps? If freedom is the goal, how do we practically build a free society?
To do that, we need a practical framework. We have to identify the specific tools that build human capability. The research outlines 5 interconnected, instrumental freedoms. Think of these not as abstract philosophical ideals, but as the actual gears of a functioning society.
Okay, what are the 5 gears?
They are political freedoms, economic facilities, social opportunities, transparency guarantees, and protective security.
I want to walk through these slowly because they really map out the anatomy of a healthy civilization. Let's start with political freedoms. This is usually what people think of when they hear the word freedom, right?
Yes, this encompasses the broad civil rights framework. It's the freedom to determine who should govern and on what principles. It includes the right to vote, the existence of an uncensored press, the freedom to scrutinize and criticize authorities, and the freedom of political expression.
Right. If you can't speak out when the government fails, you have no political freedom. Next are economic facilities. This sounds like just having a job, but it's deeper than that, isn't it?
Much deeper. It refers to the opportunities individuals have to utilize economic resources for the purpose of consumption, production, or exchange. Do you have the freedom to participate in trade? Do you have access to credit?
Which is huge. Access to credit is a massive bottleneck. If you have a brilliant idea for a business, but the banks legally refuse to lend to you because of your race, your gender, or your caste, your economic facility is zero.
Exactly.
You are economically unfree even if you are allowed to vote.
Exactly right. The third gear is social opportunities. These are the societal arrangements made for education, healthcare, and basic public services.
And this interlocks perfectly with the other gears, because if a society doesn't provide the social opportunity of basic literacy, how can a citizen possibly exercise their economic facility? Like, if you can't read a contract, you are barred from participating in modern economic trade. You are functionally exiled from the market.
They're completely interdependent. The fourth freedom is transparency guarantees. This deals with the basic presumption of trust in a society. It's the right to disclosure and the freedom to deal with one another without corruption, underhanded dealings, or arbitrary rules.
I think people underestimate how devastating a lack of transparency is to development. If you live in a system where you have to bribe 5 different local officials just to get a permit to open a small bakery, your economic facility is crushed.
It is.
Corruption acts as a massive hidden tax on the poor and middle class.
It creates a climate of uncertainty that freezes development entirely. And finally, the fifth freedom is protective security. This is the social safety net. It's the guarantee that even when everything goes wrong, there's a floor beneath you.
Like unemployment benefits, famine relief, emergency support for when a natural disaster strikes.
Yes, it ensures that vulnerable populations are not reduced to abject misery or starvation when they face severe systemic shocks.
Now, I really want to linger on how these freedoms interlink, specifically looking at political freedom and protective security, because there is a historical statistic here that completely blew my mind. When you looked at the historical data, there's a staggering fact regarding the relationship between voting rights and mass starvation.
It is perhaps one of the most profound empirical observations in modern socioeconomics. The data shows that no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy.
Let's really emphasize that. Never, in the entirety of recorded human history.
Never. If a country have regular elections, opposition parties, and a relatively free press, it does not experience famines.
But let's actually think about the mechanics of that, because on the surface, it sounds like magic. A ballot box doesn't magically conjure wheat out of the ground.
Right.
When a drought hits, the crops die, regardless of whether the country is a democracy or a dictatorship. So how does political freedom physically stop people from starving?
To understand the mechanics, we have to look at where famines do occur. The historical record points to famines in colonial India and Ireland under British rule, in the Ukraine in the 1930s under Stalin, in China during the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1961, in Cambodia in the 1970s, and in places like North Korea and Sudan.
All places characterized by severe authoritarian rule or colonial subjugation.
Precisely. And the reason famines happen there is a complete lack of accountability feedback loops.
Oh.
Authoritarian rulers simply do not suffer the consequences of
Oh,
famines.
wow, yeah.
If a dictator's agricultural policies fail and millions of peasants starve, the dictator still eats. His military still eats. There's no personal existential incentive for the leadership to scramble to avert the disaster.
Because no one is allowed to hold them responsible. Let's look at the Chinese famine during the Great Leap Forward. It's estimated that nearly 30 million people died. How does a government let 30 million people die without changing course?
Because the political freedom to criticize was entirely absent. There was no free press to report that the crops were failing. Local officials, terrified of being punished by the central government for missing production quotas, lied and reported massive harvests.
So the central government just kept acting like everything was fine.
Exactly. The central government continued to export grain while the countryside starved. The lack of transparency guarantees and political freedom directly caused the collapse of protective security.
So flip that to a democracy. A drought hits a democratic nation. What happens mechanically?
Democratic leaders have to win elections. They face a relentless, free press and organized opposition parties. If a famine begins to develop on their watch, the press will publish photos of starving citizens on the front page.
And the opposition is going to use that.
Absolutely. The opposition will use it to rally the public. The voters will absolutely throw the current government out of office in the next election.
So the political leaders have a massive, selfish, existential incentive to take immediate action. They will import food, launch public works programs, and distribute relief, not necessarily because they're saints, but because their political survival depends on it.
Exactly. The political freedom of the citizen guarantees the protective security of the society.
Yeah.
The feedback loop functions properly.
Okay, I completely see the logic there, but I have to play devil's advocate for a moment, because there is a very famous counter-argument to this idea that freedom is always the best engine for development.
Ah, yes, the Lee thesis.
Right. What about the Lee thesis? This is named after Singapore's former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. The core argument here is that denying civil and political rights actually stimulates economic growth, especially in developing nations. The idea is that if you have a strong authoritarian hand, you don't have to deal with messy protests, labor unions demanding higher wages, or endless partisan bickering in parliament. You can just force a country to industrialize, build the infrastructure, and get rich quick. And people point to certain fast-growing Asian economies as proof that sometimes a little autocracy is good for the GDP.
It is a widely debated thesis, and it's crucial to report on how the empirical data handles it. The data firmly rebuts the Lee thesis by looking at the broader, comprehensive picture. When researchers conduct comprehensive inter-country comparisons, they find absolutely no systematic evidence that authoritarian politics actually helps economic growth.
So it's an illusion, the dictator taking credit for the rain.
In many ways, yes. It's true that some authoritarian regimes have experienced rapid economic growth, but so have many democratic ones. Botswana, for instance, has been a shining example of democratic stability and incredibly rapid economic growth in Africa. When you isolate the variables, the real driver of economic growth is not the harshness of the political system.
What is it then?
It's a friendly economic climate. It's the presence of open markets, the provision of social opportunities like basic education and healthcare, and stable macroeconomic policies. You can implement those exact same positive economic policies within a democratic framework, and you will get the growth without having to deploy secret police to silence dissidents.
So the secret police aren't the ones building the microchip factories. The strongman tactics are superfluous to the actual economic mechanics.
Not only are they superfluous, but the framework of development as freedom argues that political freedom is constitutive of development.
What does that mean in practical terms?
It means that even if a hypothetical authoritarian regime could somehow make you 5% richer than a democratic one, you would still be fundamentally less developed. Because participating in the political life of your community, speaking your mind without fear of imprisonment, and having a voice in your government are things humans have intrinsic reason to value.
Right.
If you are denied those, you are fundamentally deprived, regardless of how much cash is in your pocket.
Okay, this brings us to a really fascinating crossroads. If freedom is so clearly the answer, if the historical data shows that democracies prevent mass starvation and authoritarianism doesn't guarantee economic growth, why do so many brilliant economists, philosophers, and politicians get it so wrong? Why do we constantly build policies that ignore human freedom?
Because of the data they choose to look at. The research introduces a critical concept here called the informational basis of justice.
The informational basis of justice. Okay, let's break that down.
Simply put, it asks, what specific information do you allow into your equation when you're deciding if a policy is good, just, or successful? And conversely, what information are you deliberately ignoring?
It's kind of like a doctor diagnosing a patient, but the doctor decides beforehand, I'm only going to look at the patient's blood pressure. I refuse to look at their heart rate, their blood sugar, or their oxygen levels.
Exactly.
If the blood pressure is fine, the doctor declares the patient perfectly healthy, even if they're actively having a heart attack.
That is a perfect analogy. The doctor's informational base is fairly narrow. In economics and political philosophy, there are three traditional evaluative systems that have dominated the conversation for centuries. And the research critiques all three of them because they all suffer from having fatally narrow informational bases. They deliberately ignore vital data about human freedom.
Let's put these three systems under the microscope. What's the first one?
The first is utilitarianism. This is the classic theory championed by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. It focuses entirely on mental satisfaction, pleasure, or happiness. According to utilitarianism, the ultimate goal of a society is to maximize the sum total of utility or happiness across the population.
Okay, I have to challenge the critique here, because on its face, that sounds absolutely flawless. Isn't maximizing human happiness the ultimate point of everything?
Yeah.
If I look at a society and everyone in it says they're happy, isn't that the definitive proof of a successful developed civilization? Why would anyone reject happiness as the metric?
It sounds ideal until you understand human psychology and the phenomenon of mental conditioning,
Yeah.
or what is sometimes called adaptive desires.
Adaptive desires, like learning to, like something you initially hated.
More like learning to survive by crushing your own expectations.
Oh.
The utilitarian metric is deeply structurally unfair to the persistently deprived. Think of historically oppressed minorities, sharecroppers living in a cycle of unbreakable debt, or subdued housewives living in severely sexist patriarchal cultures.
People who have been marginalized for their entire lives or even for generations.
Yes. To survive a lifetime of marginalization, people have to adapt. If you wake up every single day in a system that denies you basic rights, demanding radical change or dwelling on your subjugation is either physically dangerous or psychologically unbearable.
So what do humans do?
We adapt.
We adapt our desires. We learn not to expect much. We find tiny, fleeting pleasures where we can, in a small meal, a brief moment of rest, sunny day, just to make life tolerable.
Oh, wow. So if a utilitarian economist comes along with a clipboard and surveys a group of totally oppressed people asking, are you satisfied with your life today? They might actually say yes.
Right.
Not because their life is objectively good, but because they've successfully lowered their expectations to the floor just to survive the psychological trauma of their reality. Exactly. And the utilitarian calculus looks at that survey data and says, great, utility is high. They're happy. No policy intervention is needed here.
That is incredibly insidious. Measuring their happiness actually hides their deep structural deprivation. It takes advantage of their psychological survival mechanism to justify their ongoing oppression.
It rewards the oppressor for successfully crushing the aspirations of the oppressed. That's the fatal flaw in the informational base of utilitarianism. It only looks at mental state and ignores objective freedom.
Okay, utilitarianism is officially dismantled for me. What's the second traditional system we use?
The second is libertarianism. This system takes almost the exact opposite approach. It completely ignores mental states and consequences and focuses strictly on procedures and the absolute priority of rights, particularly property rights and individual liberties. It judges a society purely by whether these procedural rules are followed.
So this is the ultimate rule of law approach. Again, playing devil's advocate, prioritizing liberty and rights sounds fantastic. How can prioritizing individual rights be a bad thing?
The critique here focuses on the more extreme versions of libertarian theory, like Robert Nozick's view of rights as absolute side constraints. In this view, fundamental rights, especially property rights, cannot be violated for any reason, period. The consequences don't matter. The rule is the rule.
Okay, so if the rule is you can't steal my property, even if stealing it would make 100 people happy, the libertarian says, too bad, the property right is absolute.
Right. But the research points out a terrifying flaw in this informational base by looking back at the mechanics of famines. Gigantic, catastrophic famines can and do happen without anyone's libertarian property rights being violated.
Wait, how do you have a mass starvation event without violating rights? Don't famines happen because someone steals all the food?
Not always. Often the food is sitting right there in the market, legally owned by a merchant. But the poor, destitute laborer simply doesn't have the legal entitlements, the property, or the wages to buy it. Their labor has become worthless due to an economic shock.
Oh, I see.
The merchant has the absolute property right to keep his grain, and the laborer has no legal right to take it.
So they just starve.
They starve legally. The procedural rules of libertarianism are perfectly intact, the property rights are respected, no laws are broken, and 1 million people die of hunger.
That is incredibly dark. So a system that allows catastrophic mass moral horrors to occur as long as all the legal paperwork is filed correctly is fundamentally broken. Its informational base is blind to human survival.
Okay, so utilitarianism is blinded by lowered expectations, and libertarianism is blinded by rigid legal procedure. What's the third system?
The third is Rawlsian justice, based on the monumental work of the philosopher John Rawls, specifically his concept of justice as fairness. Rawls recognized the flaws in the first two systems, so he focused his informational base on the distribution of what he called primary goods.
Primary goods being what? Essentially, all-purpose resources. Wealth, income, basic liberties, opportunities, things any rational person would want to pursue their life plans. Rawls argued for a system that ensures a fair distribution of these means to live a good life, paying special attention to the least advantaged in society.
Okay, this seems vastly better. It's not falling into the happiness trap, and it's not letting people starve over a contract. Give everyone a fair, equitable share of actual resources. Surely, the framework of development as freedom doesn't reject Rawls.
It doesn't reject him entirely. In fact, it builds heavily on his foundation. But it identifies a crucial blind spot. Even ensuring an equal distribution of primary goods fails to account for the massive reality of human diversity.
How so? If everyone gets the same amount of resources, isn't that the definition of fairness?
Let's use a physical analogy. Imagine you are outfitting 2 people for a marathon, and you give them both the exact same, perfectly equal primary goods: a great pair of running shoes and a bottle of water.
Okay, perfectly fair distribution.
But one of the runners is a healthy 25-year-old athlete, and the other runner is a 70-year-old with a severe chronic illness and mobility issues. Giving them equal resources does not give them equal freedom to complete the race.
Ah, I get it. The 70-year-old needs drastically more resources. Maybe a wheelchair, medical support, a specialized track, just to achieve a fraction of the standard of living or the capability of the healthy 20-year-old.
Precisely. Rawls focuses entirely on the means to freedom, the resources. But his informational base ignores the fact that people have vastly different abilities to convert those means into actual freedom. A pregnant woman, a person with a severe disability, or an elderly person living in a malaria endemic zone needs significantly more income and resources to achieve the same basic functioning as a healthy young man in a temperate climate.
So measuring resources isn't enough because a dollar does not buy the same amount of freedom for every person. So what's the alternative? If we can't use the dashboard of happiness, the dashboard of legal rights, or the dashboard of equal resources, what dashboard are we supposed to use to measure a society?
The solution introduced is the capability approach. This shifts the informational base entirely. Instead of looking at resources or mental states, we must focus on 2 things: functionings and capabilities.
Functionings and capabilities. Let's define those very clearly.
Functionings are the actual things a person manages to do or be in their life. Being adequately nourished, being in good health, being educated, participating in community life, having self-respect. These are the states of being.
Okay, so functionings are the actual lived realities.
Yes, and capabilities refer to the substantive freedom a person has to achieve alternative combinations of those functionings. It's the real practical opportunity you have to choose the life you want to lead.
So it's the freedom to choose the functioning. Let me see if I grasp this. What is the difference between a functioning and a capability in the real world?
The clearest example is the difference between fasting and starving.
Fasting and starving. Okay, go on.
Imagine 2 people who are currently not eating. From a strict observational standpoint, their functioning at this exact moment is identical. They're both undernourished.
Right, if you just take a snapshot, they look exactly the same.
But imagine one of them is a wealthy, healthy individual who has chosen to fast for religious or political reasons. The other is an impoverished, destitute peasant who has no access to food. Their capabilities are entirely different.
Oh, absolutely.
The wealthy person has the capability, the substantive freedom, to walk into a kitchen and eat whenever they choose. They're simply choosing the functioning of fasting. The destitute person has no choice. Their freedom is zero.
That is a brilliant distinction. The capability approach measures the freedom of choice, not just the end result. So, how does this capability dashboard change how we view massive socioeconomic problems in the real world? Like, how does it redefine poverty?
It redefines poverty fundamentally. It proves that poverty isn't merely a low income, it's capability deprivation. To see how this works in practice, we could look at a fascinating comparative analysis of the differing societal failures of the United States and Western Europe.
I really want to get into this US versus Europe dilemma because this is where all this high-level philosophy hits the pavement of actual public policy.
Let's look at Europe first. Historically, and particularly during the late 90s when much of this analysis was framed, many Western European countries struggled with persistently high unemployment rates, sometimes hovering around 10 to 12%.
Which is incredibly high by US standards. But Europe has a totally different approach to that problem, right?
Yes. If you view the world through a traditional income-based lens, Europe solves this unemployment problem fairly well. They provide incredibly generous unemployment benefits and social safety nets. The state steps in and replaces a significant portion of the lost income.
So the utilitarian or the resource-focused economist looks at Europe and says, problem solved. The unemployed person still has money to buy food and rent an apartment. Their utility is preserved, their resources are adequate.
But when you apply the capability approach, it reveals massive, unaddressed deprivation. The research argues that unemployment is not merely a deficiency of income. Work provides functionings far beyond a paycheck.
Right, there's a massive psychological component to having a job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Long-term unemployment causes severe psychological harm, a loss of motivation, the deterioration of cognitive and physical skills, an increase in clinical depression, and profound social exclusion. Human beings derive a sense of purpose, identity, and community integration from their occupations.
Yeah.
Having the state hand you a check every month absolutely does not replace the capability and the freedom provided by being an active, participating, valued member of society.
Wow. So Europe is essentially treating the most obvious symptom, the lack of cash, but completely ignoring the underlying disease of social exclusion and psychological decay. They're maintaining the unemployed person's income, but allowing their capabilities to rot.
That is exactly the critique. Now, contrast that with the United States. The U.S. system generally prioritizes keeping unemployment rates lower. The labor market is more flexible, and there's immense pressure to get people into jobs.
So the U.S. fixes the social exclusion problem. Everyone is working.
But the U.S. fails spectacularly in providing other basic capabilities, most notably medical security. The U.S. links health coverage tightly to specific types of employment or wealth. As a result, tens of millions of people lack basic health insurance.
Which brings us right back to the Harlem paradox. The U.S. forces you to run a marathon every single day, working multiple jobs just to earn the basic right to a hospital bed.
Precisely. The U.S. provides the capability of employment, but brutally denies the fundamental freedom of health security to a massive chunk of its population. This leads directly to the devastating, disproportionate mortality rates we discussed at the beginning.
It's like two different flavors of unfreedom. Europe denies the freedom of social inclusion through meaningful work, and the U.S. denies the freedom to survive a medical emergency without risking total bankruptcy. But you can only see both of those failures clearly if your dashboard is measuring capabilities rather than just looking at bank accounts or legal property rights.
That's the power of the capability framework. It forces you to look at the whole human being.
Okay, so if we agree that delivering these comprehensive capabilities is the ultimate goal of a society, how do we actually do it? This brings us to the elephant in the room, capitalism. We have to look at the free market. But the research suggests we have to look at it correctly, not as a magical, infallible wand that fixes everything, but as a basic mechanical human interaction.
The research provides a very nuanced, dual defense of the free market. It's vital to understand this, because it neither blindly worships the market nor entirely rejects it. The defense is broken into two parts. The first is what we call the constitutive defense.
Constitutive, meaning it's part of the core structure of freedom itself.
Exactly. The freedom to exchange words, goods, or gifts is a basic human liberty. It's a fundamental part of how human beings interact in a society. To deny someone the right to voluntarily trade with their neighbor is a profound violation of their freedom.
So the freedom to enter a market is intrinsically valuable, regardless of whether it actually makes you rich.
Yes. To illustrate how universally recognized this is, the research points out a surprising historical fact. Even Karl Marx, who is obviously the most famous critic of capitalism in history, praised the American Civil War as a monumental leap forward for human freedom.
Wait, Karl Marx praised American labor markets.
Yeah.
Why?
Because the Civil War abolished slavery and replaced it with the freedom of labor contracts. For Marx, the ability of a worker to choose who they work for, to negotiate a wage, and to enter the open labor market was a fundamental, necessary step out of absolute bondage. Even the harshest critics of capitalism acknowledge that the freedom to exchange your labor is a core human capability.
That is a wild historical detail.
Okay.
So the first defense is that trading is a basic freedom. What's the second defense?
The second defense is instrumental. This is the more traditional economic view. Markets are incredibly effective instruments for creating economic growth, generating wealth, and expanding overall living standards. They are powerful tools for efficiency.
But, and I assume this is a massive but, in the context of everything we've discussed, markets alone are not enough to create a developed society, are they?
Absolutely not. This is where market fundamentalists fail. Markets are powerful engines, but an engine cannot run without oil, and it cannot steer itself. Markets require social opportunities to function effectively and equitably.
What kind of social opportunity?
Things that must be provided by the state or society at large, like basic education, public health infrastructure, and epidemiological security.
Yeah.
Think about a rapidly globalizing high-tech economy. If a large segment of the population is illiterate, they're completely incapable of participating in that market.
Right.
The market mechanism needs a healthy, educated, secure population to work its magic. If the state does not guarantee those foundational capabilities, the market will simply leave the vulnerable behind.
Okay, I want to throw a massive wrench into this whole optimistic idea that we can rationally organize a society, use the market, and provide social opportunities to build capabilities. I want to talk about Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem. For the listeners who aren't deep into game theory or mathematical economics, this is a very famous theorem that essentially proves that rational democratic choice is mathematically impossible. It basically says that if you try to aggregate the diverse, selfish preferences of a large group of people into one coherent social decision, you will inevitably run into paradoxes and contradictions. Doesn't Arrow's theorem prove that we're all just too selfish and different to ever make this capability approach work on a large scale?
It's a brilliant theorem, and it won Arrow the Nobel Prize. And you're right, it has often been interpreted by political scientists as deeply pessimistic proof that democracy is inherently flawed and that rational social choice requires a dictator to force a decision. But the analysis of Arrow's theorem in our source material completely flips that pessimistic interpretation on its head.
How? Because math is math. You can't argue with a mathematical paradox.
You can't argue with the math, but you can scrutinize the inputs of the math. The research points out that Arrow's theorem only proves that rational social choice is impossible if you use a severely limited informational base.
There's that phrase again, the informational base.
Yes. Let me use an everyday analogy to explain how Arrow's math works. Imagine you and two friends are trying to vote on where to go for dinner. There are three options: a steakhouse, a vegan cafe, and a pizza place.
Okay, the classic group text nightmare.
Exactly. Now, according to the strict rules of Arrow's informational base, you are only allowed to look at preference rankings. You only know that friend A ranks steak first, pizza second, vegan third. Friend B ranks vegan first, pizza second, steak third, and so on. If you try to aggregate those blind rankings through majority rule, you can end up in a mathematical loop where pizza beats vegan, vegan beats steak, but steak beats pizza. It's a cyclical paradox. No rational choice can be made.
Right, it's a tie that can never be broken. Society is paralyzed.
Yes, but only because you restricted your information to blind rankings. What if you broaden the informational base? What if you were allowed to know why they rank them that way?
Okay.
What if you learned that friend A is actually a billionaire who eats steak every night, and friend B is a devout vegan who literally cannot eat at the steakhouse without violating their deeply held ethical beliefs?
Suddenly, it's not just a math puzzle about rankings, it's about needs and capabilities. If I know friend B physically or ethically cannot eat steak, the rational social choice becomes obvious. We go to the vegan cafe or the pizza place.
Precisely. Arrow's theorem assumes we are making social choices while completely blindfolded to poverty, health, intensity of need, and human capability. If you force society to vote blindfolded, yes, the math breaks. But if you take off the blindfold, if you broaden the informational base to include data on human suffering and capabilities, rational social choice is highly possible, and in fact, it happens every day.
That is incredibly liberating. The math only dooms us if we refuse to look at each other's humanity. And this actually leads perfectly into how the research rehabilitates the image of the most misunderstood man in economics, Adam Smith.
Yes, the ghost of Adam Smith haunts almost all economic policy, and usually for the wrong reasons.
Because everyone knows Adam Smith as the ultimate unapologetic champion of pure selfish greed, right? The invisible hand. Everyone always quotes his famous line about the butcher and the baker. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. People use that quote to argue that humans are just calculating robots, maximizing our own bank accounts, and that greed is the only reliable engine for society.
It is arguably the most overused and contextually abused quote in the history of economics, and the research spends significant time correcting the record. Because Adam Smith did not believe humans were purely driven by gross cupidity and greed.
He did.
Not at all. While he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which analyzes market mechanics, he also wrote a profoundly important philosophical work called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In that book, Smith wrote extensively about human psychology, focusing on concepts like sympathy, commitment, and what he called the impartial spectator.
What's the impartial spectator?
It's Smith's concept for our human capacity for moral reasoning. He argued that when we make decisions, we have the ability to step outside of our own selfish desires and evaluate our actions through the eyes of an imagined, objective observer and impartial spectator. We ask ourselves, would a fair-minded person judge my actions as just?
So Smith believed we actually care about fairness and justice, not just profit.
Absolutely. He believed that human rationality is broad. It includes our self-interest, yes, but it also crucially includes our capacity for sympathy and our adherence to social values. A successful market relies heavily on trust, social norms, and a shared sense of justice. If everyone acts purely out of ruthless short-term greed, the market collapses into fraud and violence. Denying our moral capacity limits our understanding of what humans are actually capable of achieving.
And to prove that human beings are capable of these rational, socially beneficial choices, to prove that we aren't just mindless, greedy organisms, the research tackles one of the most terrifying and contentious global issues out there: overpopulation.
This is a vital section of the analysis because the debate over population growth is where theories about human rationality truly clash. The research contrasts two historical viewpoints that have shaped global policy. On one side, you have the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus.
The famous Malthusian trap. Explain his viewpoint, because it was incredibly influential, right?
It was massively influential. Writing in the late 18th century, Malthus believed that human beings, particularly the poor, were essentially slaves to their biological impulses. He argued that populations would inherently grow exponentially, while food production could only grow arithmetically. Therefore, he believed the poor would breed uncontrollably until they literally starved to death.
A very grim, condescending view of humanity. We're just locusts who will eat until we die.
Exactly. And because he believed this, Malthus vehemently opposed public relief for the poor, like the poor laws in England. He argued that giving food or money to the starving would only encourage them to have more children, thereby making the inevitable starvation event even worse in the future. His theories actually influenced the disastrously slow British response to the Irish potato famine decades later.
So Malthusian logic literally killed people. Who was on the other side of this debate?
A contemporary of Malthus, the French philosopher and mathematician Condorcet. Condorcet took a completely different, profoundly more optimistic view. Condorcet believed in human reason and human agency. He predicted that as society progressed, specifically through the expansion of education, better security and greater freedom, people would make reasoned, voluntary decisions to lower their fertility rates.
So Malthus said people are mindless breeders who need to be starved into submission by nature, and Condorcet said people are rational beings who will naturally choose to have fewer children if you give them education and freedom.
Right.
The ultimate debate over human nature. What does the empirical evidence actually show? Who was right?
The historical and empirical evidence comprehensively supports Condorcet. The development as freedom approach proves that coercion is not only a horrific violation of human rights, it is practically unnecessary.
When you say coercion, you mean things like China's one-child policy or the forced sterilization camps that occurred in India during the 1970s?
Yes. The research impartially reports the findings without geopolitical endorsement. Coercive, authoritarian attempts to control population are direct violations of the capability approach. and they often cause massive social trauma. So what actually works to lower fertility rates?
Outstanding freedom.
Expanding freedom. Specifically, the data shows that expanding female literacy, female work opportunities, and free public discussion naturally and radically lowers fertility rates. We see this vividly in states like Kerala and India, where high levels of female education and agency led to fertility rates dropping faster than in countries with strict coercive policies.
It's entirely about women's agency.
Exactly. Young women are only trapped in the role of progeny-generating machines when they are denied decisional power, education, and economic independence. When you empower women, when you give them the capability to read, to work outside the home, to survive childbirth, and to participate in public life, they rationally choose to have fewer children.
Wow.
Population growth rate drops dramatically and sustainably.
It is such a beautiful vindication of human reason. The solution to the population problem isn't less freedom, it isn't dictatorial coercion, it's more freedom.
It proves Condorcet was right. We are not locusts. We are capable of rational, socially beneficial choices when our capabilities are supported.
But, and I'm going to push back again here on behalf of the geopolitics and history nerds listening, there's a persistent argument out there that concepts like human rights, women's agency, and political freedom are uniquely Western concepts. The argument says that trying to apply this capability approach globally ignores distinct cultural traditions, specifically Asian values, which supposedly prioritize discipline, order, loyalty to the state, and authoritarianism over individual freedom.
The research anticipates this exact argument and thoroughly debunks it. It is vital to understand how the historical record handles this claim. The idea that there is a singular monolithic set of Asian values that inherently supports authoritarianism is a historical fallacy.
How so? Because proponents of this idea usually quote Confucius to back it up.
They do, but they selectively quote him. Asian history is incredibly vast and diverse. The research points out that if you look at traditions like Buddhism, you find a massive emphasis on tolerance, freedom, and open discussion. Gautama Buddha himself championed egalitarianism and the freedom of individuals to seek enlightenment. Emperor Ashoka in India, ruling in the 3rd century BC, erected pillars across his empire, championing tolerance of diverse beliefs and the welfare of all citizens.
So the roots of freedom and human rights are just as deeply embedded in Asian history as they are in European history.
Absolutely. The research argues that using a narrow, highly selective reading of Asian history to justify modern authoritarianism is historically dubious and politically manipulative. The desire for freedom, the capacity for reason, and the need for basic capabilities are not Western inventions. They are universal human traits.
This has been a massive, sweeping journey. We've gone from 8th century Sanskrit texts and ancient Athens to the mortality rates in Harlem and the riot-torn streets of Dhaka. We've mathematically broken down Kenneth Arrow's theorem, rehabilitated Adam Smith, and settled a 200-year-old debate on overpopulation. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's synthesize everything we've uncovered today.
If we distill this entire framework down to its absolute core, the paradigm shift is this. Development is not the accumulation of capital. It's not just opening markets, balancing budgets, or growing the gross national product. Those are merely tools. The actual definition of development, the only definition that matters, is the removal of unfreedoms.
It's actively dismantling the barriers that keep people from choosing the lives they want to live.
Yes, it's about fundamentally changing how we view humanity. We must stop viewing individuals as passive patients who are just waiting around for state handouts or waiting for wealth to magically trickle down from the billionaires at the top. We must view people as active agents.
Right.
When human beings are empowered with basic capabilities like health security, education, political voice, and economic opportunity, they are entirely capable of shaping their own destinies and building prosperous, resilient societies.
And this framework fundamentally changes how you should view your own life, your community, and the news you read every single day. When you look at a new government policy or a corporate decision or a community project in your town, you have to train yourself to look past the money. You have to ask a deeper diagnostic question. What underlying capabilities and freedoms are actually at play here? Is this policy expanding human freedom? Or is it just moving money around while keeping the traps intact?
It gives you a much more powerful, accurate diagnostic tool to understand the world. You're no longer just looking at the size of the gas tank. You're looking to see if the steering wheel actually works.
Exactly. Which brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with. Something to mull over today as you go about your business. It builds on everything we've talked about, but it brings it right out of the realm of global economics and directly into your living room. We started this deep dive by talking about how we want a clean, simple metric for success, like a healthy bank account. But if our true measure of wealth is the substantive freedom to choose a life we have a reason to value, I want you to look at your own daily routine. Look at your workplace. Look at the digital systems, the economic systems, and the social structures you participate in every single day.
That's a great exercise.
Are those systems actually expanding your capabilities? Are they giving you more agency, more time, more mental space to pursue what matters to you? Or are they just making you a slightly wealthier patient? What would it look like to start measuring your own life's progress, not by the size of your bank account, but by the sheer volume of your freedoms?